Well, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, and thank you again for everyone for taking the time to join our next installment of H&A Educational Webinar Series, H&A Credits and Incentives Report, Spring 2019. I truly appreciate everybody has incredibly busy schedules, so it's an honor to have you all take this time today to spend with us. We'll roughly presentation about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers at the end. Also, the report that we'll be discussing is available online on our website at www.hickeyassociates.com for more details. As we get started, just a couple quick items of housekeeping. For your convenience, as you might have noticed, you've been muted upon entry. That'll save us from that dog barking, any voice, other conference calls in the background. But certainly as we get to the Q&A period, we will open it up at the time. But we do encourage everyone to utilize the chat function, which you should see at the top right of your screen. It may be on the top left, depending on the WebEx platform you're utilizing. But please use that. You can pose a question to the entire group or to me directly. And again, to introduce, this is David Hickey with Hickey Associates. And again, we'll open up the floor, encourage everyone through that chat function, but then also audibly. And just, and as you also may have noticed from the screen, is the webinar session is being recorded, and we will have that available online on our website at www.hickeyassociates.com. So just a really quick background on who we are, Hickey Associates. So we have been around and doing what we do in site selection since 1986, so entering our 34th year in the industry. We are the leading global firm in the world of site selection, credit and incentive advisory, and workforce solutions on an annual basis. We complete about 400 projects, and all capture and manage about $3 billion USD in incentives, and average project cost savings are about 31%. Some may ask, what do site selectors do? Well, we help across the board assist in our clients as they navigate the world and their global footprints and trying to find the most optimal location. That those factors can run the gamut, and what is most important, but looking at labor, logistics, incentive compliance, in prior projects, site due diligence, and importantly, what we're going to spend the time today is on economic development incentives. Just a really quick primer in case just so we know exactly we're on the same page when it comes to incentives and what we're referring to. I know there's a lot of incentives in the meetings industry. There's incentives in when you're talking about a landlord type of relationship. But in this sense, we're talking about those that drive real estate and economic development. So these are resources, financial support, which are available to a business through states, counties, municipalities, regional entities, and utilities, among other organizations, as well as could be from the federal government, many places outside the U.S. Today's focus is going to be on the American landscape, but also national governments too, and competing against one another. Communities ultimately benefit from the jobs and capital investment that are driven into the local region, and businesses benefit by ultimately reducing costs, discovering additional resources, technical assistance, as well as more project confidence, which is not just important for the real estate team, but really across the board in any business operation. Important to note that they're competitive in nature. Most of the time, there's a but for, as it's called, that without those incentives, it wouldn't be possible. Wouldn't be captured in place. To always understand that element. Also, something we'll talk about with a little more length is on some of this more drive for taxpayer return on investment and transparency, shining more light on these incentives and where they're going. And then also this item of discretionary and statutory. A lot of the incentives we'll talk today are in a sense of statutory. You do it, you create the jobs, you make the investment, you pay the minimum wages, you'll be able to capture those incentives. But there's many programs in this country that are really on a discretionary basis, where there's some sort of case and it must be approved and a level through a government entity and a public process along the way, and we'll talk about a few of those as well. And what we're really talking about across the board is the findings of the most recent report, the U.S. Credits and Incentives Update. It's available online, www.hickeyassociates.com. Really, we're covering a number of different trends across the United States when it comes to incentives, economic development policies. We have a spotlight on some different state initiatives, as well as some of the programs and updates at the federal level, and then also some significant looks on major investment projects, and one that I'm sure everyone on the call is very familiar with later on today. Really, so when looking at the site selection process, on lists of different factors. And depending on what that project might be, it could be a warehouse to logistics, headquarters, a back office operations, shared services, a tech center, an IT help desk, whatever that might be. There's a number of different factors that come into play. Very rarely are incentives ever a driving factor of the ultimate how you get down. But ultimately, when you're looking at that final location, weighing one location against another, incentives do often very well come into play. And part of that is, again, helping with the project confidence, helping reach some of that cost delta challenges that would be there, developing a public-private partnership. And it's not, again, always about finance and dollars and cents, but it'll also be technical, recruitment assistance that could be in line from a local workforce development board, job application intakes even. Those can be considered incentives along with the infrastructure, property tax abatements, sales tax abatements, exemptions, whatever that might be, how they come into play and really driving that ultimate decision and how a company determines where to locate. So let's go into the findings of the report. So first, kind of taking a federal view, one of the big factors and is affecting companies and individuals across the board is the new tax laws that's come into effect for the 2018 tax year. First and foremost, change in brackets. There's some significant changes on the income level, not to go into detail, but there's some on the screen and as well as on the corporate side. So we are certainly hearing more and more from our clients, where there are some advantages they're finding with that reduced income tax, corporate income tax rate across the board. But is it driving companies and investments into the U.S.? Still to be seen. We are seeing some, seeing not, but certainly there are some companies that do have more cash on hand are making some decisions because they know what's in part. But really, when the news and what you're really hearing, the biggest impact today is probably on the state and local tax deduction side. Now living at a maximum $10,000, and so that's certainly impacting, especially here I sit today in New York City, in the state of New York, state of New Jersey, state of California, are certainly three states where residents are seeing more of a some in a negative sense as far as what the tax cuts and provisions have done. But it's certainly an impact and something to look at and how that goes forward. Another federal program, which is hot in the press on the economic development side, are opportunity zones, which also was created out of the tax cut legislation. And really what the opportunity zones still kind of getting their feet underway, as you'll see the image on the right, are those that should be designated opportunity zones across the country. And really what it allows, it's a way to induce investors to put their money towards some of those census tracts across the country that are facing economic disparity, that are in that place. And what it allows is more savings as far as capital gains exchange the longer it's held into place. How that's going to necessarily affect corporate real estate is still to be seen. How ultimately the program is, rules are still being released on it, but certainly something to stay aware of and be on top of, particularly for economic developers as they're looking to drive investment to particular parts of their region and of their communities. Another one that is certainly getting a lot of attention in around the country is the Green New Deal. Really a pretty fascinating look and drive some, on a political realm, but besides the politics, looking into impact on corporate real estate and economic development, would be a drive for upgrade of all buildings as one of the resolutions for energy efficiency, eliminate all agriculture-related greenhouse gases, complete overhaul of transportation systems, a guaranteed job for all, as well as high-quality health care. Costs in the trillions. And certainly some may reject it, or it's a resolution, it's an overall, but it is a very important idea and concept when we're looking at how is the country, what is the direction of the country going, and looking at economic development and what are some of those core elements. Climate change is one of those factors that continues to rise up, and overall, when looking at the numbers and importance and interests of Americans, something there as well. And so seeing that building and the development of that will certainly be important as we continue forward. We saw a gubernatorial shift. So this is a major change across not only in Congress did we see the changes and we see the new realm, but also the major executive leadership changes across the country. So as you're seeing develop on the screen here are the states that have a new governor in place, some that were changed over from Democrat to Republican, across the board. So important element to look at here and still much to be seen. But what are some of the great impacts that are going to be there when looking at the governor? So you have in states like Michigan with Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who's coming in tasked with, we'll talk in a little bit about transparency measures. That was left in there from the previous administration. In the state of Wisconsin, now with Governor Scott Walker, not there in Madison anymore. What is the future of projects like Foxconn, and how is that going to work? And the Trump administration with such a heavy hand and aspect in that. In the state of Illinois, with new Governor Pritzker, and kind of the previous years with the Rauner administration. A lot of uncertainty that was in place, but still strong growth in some areas. But looking at the EDGE tax credit particularly, the retention aspect of the incentive was not preeminent anymore, even though part of the law. How is Governor Pritzker going to look at that? Still some things and transition that is going on in the state. And then not just a party change, but also even in the state of Florida with Governor DeSantis. And how is that, overall, what is his approach going to be to things like Enterprise Florida and some of the incentives and just some of the different elements. Still driving, still jobs and many projects going to the Sunshine State. But, how is that new approach going to be with Governor DeSantis, and something certainly to stay close to. We had a project this past year that, technically is still going, that's truly changed the game forever. Everybody on this call or in this session is familiar with HQ2 and the nationwide and really multi-nation with in North America as Canada being involved as well, but an overall search, very public search across the U.S. For Amazon and what they're calling their second headquarters. Originally, it was 50,000 jobs, $5 billion in capital investment, and about $150,000 per average wage. They put out a public RFP, offered offered for communities around the country to pursue, and really offer what they have as a community and what that presentation. We saw an incredible amount of very creative and robust ideas. There's a picture of Tucson delivering a cactus for Mr. Bezos. You had cities putting buttons up, mayors opening and ordering thousands of boxes. You had the state of Maryland, who's one of the most aggressive when it came to the incentive and introducing the Prime Act, as they called it. Overall would have been billions, about $7 billion altogether for the mark. But looking at the state of Maryland, the way that they drove that economic impact and the model of it, $17 billion in revenue coming out of it, so the return on investment would be pretty significant as far as looking at it. Well, after the significant and hundreds of communities and entities introduced and offered up submitted responses to Amazon, they narrowed down to the final 20 on the list, and there you can see those. Really across the country, not much obviously in the upper Northwest as seen, but certainly some very interesting cities, some that were expected, some that could have been surprises to some, but certainly a lot of growth, a lot of new, a lot of very millennial cities as well across the board. So ultimately, in the end of those 20, the narrowed down, and it wasn't narrowed to one. In fact, the project was spread out over 3 locations. So again, as part of that, so 25,000 jobs are going to Long Island City, New York City. 25,000 jobs going to Virginia in the D.C. area and in Crystal City, in the Alexandria, Crystal City area, and as well as another 5,000 into Nashville, in more of an operations center, about $230 million in capital investment, and about 1 million in square feet altogether. Some of these numbers have tweaked a little bit as the time's gone on. D.C., you're hearing reports of being as high as 6 million square feet, and across the board, of course, with New York. But just let's look at the incentives as the focus here. Really across the board, vast majority of these incentives are on a post-performance basis. Again, requiring $150,000 in average wages. So from the state, about $550 million over 12 years. From the Commonwealth of Virginia, locally, discretionary cash grant about $23 million, driven out of the transient occupancy tax, the visitors tax, and a lot of this is going to go to infrastructure. $195 million. In fact, that'll go to metro improvements and a pedestrian bridge. For those who are familiar with Crystal City and where, as they're calling National Landing, we'll actually create a bridge, pedestrian bridge that connects DCA, Reagan Airport, from the Amazon HQ2 facility to the airport directly, and also about $28 million in tax increment financing. In the city of Nashville, again, a post-performance, requiring $150,000 in average wages. State discretionary cash grant about $65 million over 7 years, local 15, and a jobs tax credit from the state of just under $22 million over 7 years. Then to the controversial one, to say the least. In Long Island City, New York, again, in post-performance for the most part, $150,000 average wages, an Excelsior tax credit in excess of $1.2 billion in refundable tax credits, another cash grant of over $325 million over 10 years, a significant pilot payment in lieu of taxation from the city, and then also a couple as-of-right incentives per se. They're pretty expansive as far as the ICAP and the REAP programs. Well, as Amazon was ready to go and ready to move in, and after the announcement, the activists, certainly got loud and were in place. It wasn't an immediate. There certainly has been an underlining level from the beginning in the project, but certainly was building and building over time. Ultimately, Amazon, as many of you know, have announced that they pulled out. This was an extreme displeasure of the governor, of the mayor, to many of the business, government, and local leaders. Still to be determined on what Amazon's next move will be, if they're going to find another location for HQ2 in this 25,000 jobs. They're going to move more of those to Crystal City or to Nashville or Seattle or some other location. I think of recent notes have shown that Seattle is unlikely to see any more growth there, despite having 2 million new square feet coming on. Also with Crystal City, interesting on the job front, what types of roles are coming in, more clarity on that, perhaps more administrative type roles than may have been originally anticipated. But certainly from a project at the outset that was different, was unprecedented in its size and scope and public knowledge, and then to where we are today. Very interesting. Just over the past couple of days, a poll that was conducted here in New York City and in the state of New York from Siena College. It's really evaluating overall public opinion. There have been many polls that have been done nationally and as well as locally about the support for the project. Some of it kind of a mixed bag, depending on, I think, one thing, how the questions are asked. But just in this recent poll that was released, so 67% supported overall. In actual fact, 61% fully supported it with the incentives. The numbers have all been around between 70 and 80% that supported the project, but less and sometimes less than majority as far as with the incentives involved. As time has passed over these past few weeks and couple of months, more of that support and the realization of losing 25,000, $2.5 billion, and so forth, has really hit home a little bit further. And one of the questions is and continues to be is who is to blame? And it's interesting that Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez was already on there and actually found her way back into the presentation already, as in fact 37% to 38% of those polled, really put the Congresswoman from the Bronx as the number one to blame, but as well as activists, the mayor, the governor, the Amazon itself, the state Senate, which certainly has been a challenge in some realms, and particularly in the last couple of months, and then as well, and kind of an underlying factor that some are overlooking, and of course is still to be viewed and understand on the labor union side as well. So many are familiar with the project, but I think it's not ended. It's not to say, and certainly the impact that will have on incentives and economic development in New York, in the Northeast, and across the country is still to be seen and still to be heard. But going into now some of the trends that we're seeing around the country as well. So big piece is on the transparency and return on investment. So really shining light on incentives. Just to touch on some of those states and the big piece. Some of these are laws that are coming in place. Some are legislation that's introduced. One in the state of Kansas, which would require the establishment of a new database and state auditing procedures. The mandate basically data capture on programs that award in excess of $50,000 on an annual basis. One of the challenges heard in Kansas has been there isn't enough light and isn't enough transparency on these incentives, and so this legislation that's currently been introduced is in that realm. I mentioned earlier for Governor Whitmer in Michigan, she was handed over what was passed at the end of last year, Economic Development Incentive Evaluation Act, as it's called, which basically is tasking the new administration with hiring a contractor that will ultimately be tasked with evaluating and auditing incentive awards, which will ultimately be then presented back to the public. Still to be determined how that will look and what exactly that will be in light. Ohio, who through the Jobs Ohio organization, public-private partnership, they released and have been one of the more out there as far as transparency and releasing data in the past. They just released their 2018. They cited 266 projects, over 27,000 jobs, and almost $10 billion in overall payroll. An interesting data point in that is many think that economic development is only about big projects. Incentives are only about the mega projects. But really, as they found, 3 out of 4 companies that they supported in this past year were actually small and mid-market sized companies. In the state of Tennessee, the volunteer state, legislation has been introduced for, it's called the Fair Accountability and Clarity in Tax Subsidies Act, or the easier term, the FACTS Act. And what that'll do is create a new public database. One of the other challenges that's heard in Nashville and around the state is our challenges with the clawbacks, going with the fast track program, and this legislation, if becoming law, would establish additional clawback provisions to that program going forward. Another major trend that we're seeing across the country, and it's fascinating in the realm and very creative ways as well, is on remote working. And this is really trying to get individuals to relocate and encouraging businesses as well as separately encouraging individuals to relocate to certain areas and to certain communities. In the state of New Hampshire, they have recently introduced the New Hampshire College Graduate Retention Incentive Program, or New Hampshire GRIP program. This would provide $1,000 for the first 4 years after college graduation. So year on year, if a college graduate were actually to stay in New Hampshire, they would get $1,000. Now, many, as we continue to hear, and with generation is more and more on the college debt and those challenges, they could actually, the individual, have the money directed directly to the loan servicing entity instead of going directly in their pocket in order to help with that student debt challenge. Tulsa Remote, we talk about public-private partnerships, and they're not always run by governments. They're not always run by public entities, sometimes public-private partnerships, sometimes chambers. In this sense, the Tulsa Remote program is led by the George Kaiser Family Foundation. And what this is trying to encourage individuals to relocate to the Tulsa area. If you're 18 years old, you can move within 6 months, and you are already employed or self-employed, the program will actually pay you $10,000. It'll give you a dedicated co-working desk in a local Tulsa incubator space, and it'll provide a housing stipend for a 2-bedroom apartment in a downtown district. Pretty fascinating, to say the least. Another program, something that is new and certainly a concept in the state of Utah, the READY and the ROIs, the Rural Economic Development Initiative, and the Rural Online Initiative. So with this program, the first one, Rural Economic Development, is actually going to pay businesses $4,000 to $6,000 for creating rural remote jobs. Actually, one of the taglines is "Don't invest in India, invest in Utah." So basically, what they're encouraging are businesses to hire single individuals to work in a remote fashion, whether that customer service or sales or IT, help desk, whatever that might be, and trying to encourage and support. And to even help that further in rural is there are training funds, part of the Rural Online Initiative, training funds to help these individuals seek remote roles, educating on computer, on tech work, on call service, on customer service type of approaches and training. So very fascinating, and a push to hire instead of trying to drive a 100 jobs facility to go to a rural location. Instead, try to pick off one at a time, be able to get that growth across the region. In the Green Mountain State, Governor Scott has introduced a new incentive for encouraging remote workers. Many of you might be familiar with the previous credits and incentives update produced by H&A. We talked about a new tech relocation incentive. They were one of the first to create something like it. $10,000 over 2 years to get individuals to relocate if they're a remote tech worker to the state of Vermont. What this will do, as introduced by Governor Scott, would actually create so for $5,000, there are no real restrictions on the type of job, but just to get people to move to Vermont. And it would be capped at $2 million a year, but very interesting. In addition to the existing relocation program, he's also proposed an additional $2.5 million to go for marketing and recruiting to target individuals to actually move to the state of Vermont and to work in the state of Vermont. The other thing that we talk about, and it seems like each time we come up with a new edition of the update, film and TV incentives. We look at, sometimes it is the incentive programs are loved and celebrated, while other times they're the crux, and it's one of the hottest debated topics in state capitals across the country. Seems like today they're up kind of on the more positive side. Alabama being one of those states that has had challenges and has been close to potential elimination of the program. Right now, they're actually showcasing a robust use of the state's film incentive, and in fact, $19 million in state tax incentives in the recent year has leveraged over almost $64 million in overall direct expenditures in the state, and that's just about 150 projects that were able to take advantage of that program. In Arkansas, the Razorback State, actually, the state Senate has approved legislation to try to take the program, not necessarily focus in the film, and move it more to an economic development and have it in that type of promotion and investment promotion type of role. So it would go under the Arkansas Economic Development Commission. It would also make the program more discretionary in manner, as opposed to come in, create, invest, but actually allow the state to have some discretion when awarding these incentives. And then also it would extend it for another 10-year period, ultimately through 2029. In the state of Colorado, this is a program that through the Colorado Film Office had a robust amount of funds, has been cut and pulled back, reduced. Governor Polis just entered in the governor's mansion in Boulder, has proposed to increase that amount to $2 million on an annual basis. Currently, it is at $750,000. Fortunately, the Colorado Joint Budget Committee voted that down unanimously, 6-0 against it. So I know it's an initiative of his, and we'll see that, I'm sure, going forward again in the near future. The state of Georgia, Savannah, was one of the first cities on the local side to create a tax incentive for productions and to encourage them to come in. We extended a local 10% rebate program, seeing the success so far. They've set aside $4 million in annual funding to encourage programs and productions to go to Georgia directly. In all, about so $250,000 cap per company, and this can be leveraged alongside the very popular and famous State of Georgia program. And many of you have seen television shows and films in the U.S., Netflix productions that has the Georgia peach at the end, and that is all part of them capturing the direct incentive from the state of Georgia. And at one point, it was delivering hundreds of millions of dollars in incentive or in investment, and now that is certainly well into the billions, to the $8-9 billion range for the state of Georgia. State of Montana is another one that currently does not have a robust in the sense of those. So they're developing the Media Act and the Montana Economic Development Industry Advancement Act, which would create a 20% tax credit and an additional 5% for films in underserved areas. And in New Mexico, there's actually been created a significant backlog of film tax credits, and the main reason for that is due to an annual payments cap. So they've new hubs and some significant productions in the Land of Enchantment, and so this legislation would authorize $225 million single payment to many of those outstanding backlog productions, which about cut in half what is that owed amount. Another bill would actually eliminate that annual cap altogether, which is actually is reportedly supported by the new governor in order to do so and allow the program to be more functional going forward. In the state of New York, one of those states that is truly celebrating the impact of the film incentive, and really that is run through the state governor's office. And since 2011, really thanks to the program, the state cites about 1,500 projects, $23 billion in spending, and nearly 1.4 million direct hires due to the project, the production incentive itself. Interesting note, in Texas, production incentives are actually available and can be used for commercial advertisements. They're one of 10 states to allow that across the country. Most actually prohibit or set limitations to what some of these production incentives can go to. But overall, they've allocated about $8 million since 2010. Been some questions and controversy over some of the loopholes, but ultimately 70% of the cast in the production must be from the state of Texas, and 60% of the production must be done in the Lone Star State alone of that commercial production. Data centers is some would say an economic development revolution. More and more of these projects are going on across the country, around the world. Really angling, in some states we'll have to have it, and some of it's really a community versus community and competing. They're not significant job creators compared to other projects. If you look at a job on a per square foot or per acre basis that's created, but they're major developments. They're great for the utilities, and overall they can bring significant economic development for a community. State of Arizona just had a great, significant announcement of a major streams data centers in Goodyear, about 150-acre plot that will be developed for, and really utilizing some of the program and exemptions of up to 20 years for transaction privilege and use taxes. Minimum investment for that would be $25 million or $50 million if the project is in Maricopa and Pima counties. State of Indiana, there is introduced legislation as they're trying to target a new significant data center project. What this new legislation will do is allow county or municipality to set up a special area designation, an enterprise zone of sorts, for data centers. And that would allow for an exemption on personal property and sales taxes, among other potential local advantages. But the minimum investment would be somewhere in the range of $25 million to $150 million, depending on the location, the investment, and the timing of that investment. A new era in place in the state of New Jersey, as in some of the most infamous incentives, controversial, but hard to debate some of the success of it, but certainly not without controversy in the state of New Jersey. Those programs are coming up with expiration. One of those most famous being the Grow New Jersey program, which has driven billions of dollars into jobs and created hundreds of thousands of jobs as well at the same time. Governor Murphy, who has just entered the governor's mansion, has created his proposal, and going forward as these programs come into expiration. Not too many significant changes. Some are looking very similar to the programs that are on place. Some of that it will more complex, more targeting, more transparency, and as well as caps. Some of those programs being New Jersey Forward, which would be a jobs-based incentive program set at $200 million. New Jersey Aspire, which would be more of a financing tool, a gap-based closing fund almost in some ways, $200 million per year. Brownfields, historic preservation, $20 million a year, and then ultimately an evergreen fund, which would be a co-investment fund for certain projects, sustainable projects, which would be set at $60 million per year, as Governor Murphy's proposal has been laid out. Other key trends across the country, just to quickly highlight, on the infrastructure side, we're seeing a number of these across the state, and really infrastructure is such a significant driver when it comes to economic development. It's hard to have economic development without the infrastructure. Now, what type of infrastructure? That varies across the region, across the community, across the ultimate asset class that's required. A few of those items. So one is in stadiums. Sports stadiums can be one of great success, can be one of great controversy. The Florida Stadium program, which exists, allows about approximately $13 million per year to be allocated for the various professional stadiums around the Sunshine State. While the program is still in existence, it is not used, and that funding is not made available. Many of the existing stadiums that are currently standing in the state do still receive different apportionments from other funds, but going forward, I know this is a challenge in some areas, including St. Petersburg, for the Tampa Bay Rays baseball stadium. In Idaho, to really try to encourage more on the housing crisis that exists in many places in this country, but one in the state of Idaho would allow for revised rules extending some tax reimbursement terms for investors. State of Maine, very interesting, fascinating. Massachusetts, Commonwealth is also involved in this, but a partnership with Hydro-Quebec, which would ultimately create a 140-mile transmission line providing power to the Northeast. And as part of that, Hydro-Quebec would actually invest in about $30 million directly into certain funds for economic development purposes, and then also an annual payment of $3.5 million to Maine residents that will help with higher costs of energy. So very interesting to see how that goes forward in the near term. Governor Wolf in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has introduced a package he's calling Restore Pennsylvania, which would be about $4.5 billion over a 4-year period for roads, rail, wastewater, water, transportation across the board. Interesting local program in the state of Washington, Spokane Valley, permitting. This is utilizing a permitting modeling process and something that could take a couple years to get through. So you could get it done in about a 6-month period, and through using modeling and some initial fees, can speed up that and expedite that permitting process. Very interesting, and it'll be one to watch as we go forward. In the state of West Virginia, Mountaineer State, introducing rate riders, a couple subsidiaries of AEP, introducing the 15% rate rider. It's really an important program, and one that can be overlooked by many in the U.S. And basically what that means is a rate rider is a reduced utility rate, electricity typically. So if to encourage and incentivize economic development, allow for a reduced rate or that rate rider in place. In Wisconsin, a new governor has introduced provisions and modifications to their tax increment district program and similar to TIF programs, and not too significant of changes for some. But what it will do is it would put a cap on developer allocations, as well as put in a new review process as far as what the overall impact of the district would have on the community, the tax basis, in the future kind of sustainability of that community. Workforce development, always important to follow and keep track of when talking about incentives and economic development. A few of those, Arizona, which originally had a normal, regular annual basis training program, has since been turned into a round process. Currently, there's $11 million available with a cap of $1.3 million per employer, and that is open for applications through May the 15th of this year. Missouri has taken a look. They are looking to eventually consolidate their workforce training programs, which will go into what is called the Missouri One Start program. So interesting, fascinating. We'll see how that, and keep an eye on it, certainly. And then in the state of Mississippi, as far as the Delta Regional Authority, some funding, public-private partnerships, is about $200,000 in funding for training initiatives in the Delta region specifically. Also looking at further on rural development, the two Carolinas have new programs on under review that would really infuse the regions with economic development investment. One of those that's been introduced by Governor Cooper would put about $145 million into rural programs that would go to infrastructure, job training, other economic development measures. While meanwhile, in just the neighbors of the South, in South Carolina, the program would invest about $85 million in different blighted communities and directly into those rural areas that need it the most. Very interesting, and could have an impact on business and economic development is a time zone debate. And this is so we're changing times. Currently, there are 3 states that are looking at changing times, or not involving in the in time zone daylight savings and the like. Currently, the state of Arizona does not reflect daylight savings, and nor does parts of the state of Indiana. Currently, what we're looking at in the state of California through a ballot initiative on a referendum to look at, voters approved to look at staying on daylight savings time. Florida is actually looking at the same, and it would be a new called Florida time, and that is both of and all of these ultimately need congressional approval, and some of the most powerful on the House as well as in the Senate. Senator Marco Rubio has introduced legislation to allow to go forward. In Wyoming, we've looked at wanting to stay on Mountain Daylight Time, and this has been a initiative that has been competed for in the several recent legislatures. In this most recent, it actually tied, did not go forward in a vote of 15-15, and ultimately what they would need is 3 contiguous states to also go to the Mountain Daylight Time consistently year-round, and so there's certainly an uphill battle there, but certainly an interesting look on what some of the initiatives are out there, and the impact on business and economic development could be great for the positive, and then as well as create challenges. And then the expansion of some existing programs. So one of those, the Kentucky Mega, a mega investment pursuit in the state of Kentucky, in the Bluegrass State, looking at revising their kind of premier program, the Business Investment Program, which would go for more of that targeting mega project. Something you're seeing more and more across the country, particularly in the Southeast, being able to adjust some of the programs that are on the books to make sure they can compete for some of these large projects. And in this consideration, it's a project that's over $200 million in investment. Could be considered for additional incentives, and within the county that they're in, could be considered for a higher incentive amount. Also creates a new job retention provision at 1,000 jobs for that, and to be able to capture that incentive. The state of Minnesota, to try to actually revive a program for angel investors, was a successful program, but certainly had controversy. And Governor Walz has talked about, new governor in St. Paul, to revive a tax credit for angel investors, which would be capped at about $20 million a year to encourage those businesses to come into place. And then also finally, what's being known as the Imagine Nebraska Act, which has been introduced in the unicameral legislature. It would be very similar to the Nebraska Advantage Act, which is the premier kind of the collaboration of several programs in the state. And under the Imagine Nebraska Act, it would actually it would create more targeting for a particular type of projects, size of projects, wages, industries, and the like, and then also more evaluation and potential callbacks as well. So encourage all of this. There's certainly many more that I haven't touched on in this presentation that you can find out more about in the U.S. Credits and Incentives Update Spring 2019 report, and certainly a number of states and programs that we were able to cover on this call today. Well, let me, at this point now, turn it over to for a few minutes for question and answer. I encourage everyone to please utilize the chat feature if you do have any questions, and you can just pose that directly to me as the host, which is into the in the chat feature. So first question is, will the presentation be available online? Yes. So we are, as on the outset, we are recording the presentation. And we'll have it available on our website at www.hickeyassociates.com, and we'll send a note to everybody that participated today and registered for the webinar, where they can find that link here in the very near future. Thank you for the question. So another question on opportunity zones and what's next. So there are still some time to see, and there are some opportunity zones that are being utilized, and investments that are being recognized in some places, but there's certainly still much to learn and more evaluation to be done by prospective investors, developers, and community leaders. It is interesting to see in some places, though, the way that the economic development entities, governors, are advertising and beginning to market some of these opportunity zones. One of those being in the state of Delaware, as the Governor Carney has set up a website that'll walk through the different opportunity zones that are in place, mapping, what are some of those target industries, what is the timing, how can you find out more information, contacts, and the like. So if anyone's interested, checking that out on the Delaware State Economic Development website. All right. Well, with no further questions, I want to thank everybody again for taking the time to join today's next installment of the H&A webinar series, Credits and Incentives Spring 2018 Update. Encourage everyone to please join the conversation. You can find us on Twitter at SiteTrend. Also, check out our LinkedIn company page at Hickey Associates. On the screen there is my contact information. Again, it's David Hickey, Managing Director of Hickey Associates. I once again truly appreciate everyone for taking the time today. We'll follow up with a note on where you can find the presentation and the recording here shortly. But again, please go on and check out our report if you haven't already done so at www.hickeyandassociates.com. Again, that's www.hickeyandassociates.com. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your week.